What if I told you that the most terrifying warriors in World War II weren't fighting for the Axis or the Allies, but were following orders from something far older and far darker than any military command? Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Comment below telling me where you're watching this from. Seriously, just type your city or country. And then hit that subscribe button, because this channel depends on your support to keep bringing you these hidden stories that powerful people don't want you to know. We're a small operation trying to expose the truth, and we need you. The file sat in a locked cabinet in the basement of Fort Huachuca, Arizona, marked only with a serial number that meant nothing to anyone who might stumble across it. No name, no classification stamp, just numbers. For 63 years, it gathered dust alongside thousands of other forgotten documents from the Second World War, until a junior archivist named Robert Chen found it during a routine digitization project in 2008. What he read that afternoon would haunt him for the rest of his life. By 2010, Chen had quit his job, moved to Seattle, and refused to discuss his time at Fort Huachuca with anyone, including his own family. When researchers finally gained access to the file in 2015, they understood why. The document detailed something called Operation Whisper Protocol, a covert program that ran from late 1942 through the end of the war. On the surface, it appeared to be a straightforward military initiative, the integration of Apache scouts into special reconnaissance units operating in the Pacific Theater. The United States military had used Native American scouts before. The practice dated back more than a century, but Operation Whisper Protocol was different. It was different in ways that violated not just military ethics, but something more fundamental. Something about the nature of war itself. The program began in November of 1942 at a remote training facility outside of Datil, New Mexico. The facility didn't appear on any official maps. Supply requisitions were routed through 3 different dummy companies. Personnel were transferred under false pretenses, told they were joining mountain warfare training or cold weather operations. In reality, they were being assessed for psychological malleability. The military wanted soldiers who would follow orders without question, even orders that made no sense, even orders that contradicted everything they'd been taught about combat doctrine and the laws of war. By January of 1943, the program had recruited 47 Apache men from reservations across New Mexico and Arizona. Most were in their early 20s. All had family histories of military service. The recruiting officers specifically sought out men whose grandfathers or great-grandfathers had fought in the Apache Wars of the 1870s and 80s. The official explanation was that these men would have inherited tactical knowledge, an understanding of guerrilla warfare and survival techniques passed down through generations. But the real reason was darker. The program wanted men who carried ancestral trauma, who had been raised on stories of betrayal and massacre, who understood that the enemy wasn't just the Japanese or the Germans, but the very concept of civilization itself. The training began with conventional military instruction, hand-to-hand combat, weapons proficiency, map reading, radio operation. But by the 3rd week, things started to change. The trainees were taken into the mountains in groups of 5 or 6. They were given minimal supplies and told to survive for 10 days. This part wasn't unusual. What was unusual were the sounds they reported hearing at night. Drums that seemed to come from the earth itself. Voices speaking in dialects that hadn't been used in more than 50 years. And the dreams. Every single trainee reported the same dream. They were standing in a canyon at dusk, watching as their ancestors approached from the shadows. The ancestors didn't speak. They simply pointed west, toward the ocean. Lieutenant Colonel James Harwick oversaw the program from its inception. His personnel file painted him as a model officer, West Point graduate, decorated veteran of the First World War, fluent in 3 languages, but his private journals, discovered in a storage unit in Tucson in 2012, told a different story. Harwick had become obsessed with what he called primal warfare, the idea that modern combat had lost something essential, something that ancient warriors understood instinctively. He believed that indigenous peoples retained access to this knowledge, that it was encoded in their culture, and could be weaponized if properly channeled. "The Apache understand something we've forgotten," Harwick wrote in March of 1943. "They know that war isn't about territory or resources. It's about breaking the enemy's spirit. It's about making them afraid of the dark, afraid of silence, afraid of their own thoughts. We can win battles with tanks and planes, but we can't win wars. Not the way they did. Not the way they still could, if we let them." By April, the training had moved into its final phase. The recruits were no longer practicing with rifles and grenades. Instead, they spent hours in sensory deprivation chambers that had been constructed in an abandoned mine shaft 12 miles from the facility. They were taught meditation techniques that bordered on self-hypnosis, and they were given injections. The medical records listed the substance as Compound 17, described only as a proprietary mixture developed for enhanced alertness during night operations. Decades later, chemical analysis would reveal that Compound 17 contained psilocybin derived from mushrooms native to the Chiricahua Mountains, combined with synthetic amphetamines and a third compound that remains unidentified. The first deployment came in June of 1943. A team of 8 Apache scouts, officially designated as Reconnaissance Unit 16, was sent to Guadalcanal. They arrived with standard gear and standard orders, conduct surveillance on Japanese positions, gather intelligence on troop movements, and report back to command. What they actually did was something else entirely. The Japanese soldiers stationed on the western edge of the island began reporting incidents almost immediately. Sentries would vanish from their posts without a sound. Entire patrols would be found dead in the jungle, arranged in patterns that mimicked ancient Apache burial practices. Supplies would disappear from secured locations, and in their place, they'd find small bundles of sage and desert tobacco, plants that didn't grow anywhere in the Pacific. The Japanese command initially dismissed these reports as psychological warfare, American attempts to demoralize the troops. But the incidents escalated. A Japanese officer named Hiroshi Yamada kept a diary that was recovered from his body in August of 1943. The entries from his final weeks are fragmentary and increasingly incoherent, but they paint a picture of systematic psychological destruction. July 19th, Yamada wrote, "Third night without sleep. The men claim they see figures moving through the camp after dark. Not Americans. Something else. Something that doesn't move like a human being. I ordered increased patrols, but 2 men disappeared during their watch. Found their rifles stacked neatly beside a tree. No blood. No tracks. Nothing." July 26th. The dreams have started. We all have the same dream. We're walking through a desert, and there are people watching us from the rocks. When we try to approach them, they disappear. But we can still feel them watching. Even after we wake up, we feel them watching. August 2nd. Lost 8 more men. Found their bodies at dawn, arranged in a circle around a fire that had burned all night. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. Medical examination shows they died of heart failure. All 8 of them at exactly the same time. I don't understand how this is possible. Yamada's final entry was dated August 9th, the day before his unit was overrun by Marine forces. They're not human, I know how that sounds. I know what the command will think if they read this, but I've seen them now. We all have. They move through the jungle like smoke. They speak without sound. And they know us. They know our names. They know our families. They know things that no enemy scout could possibly know. This isn't war. This is something worse. By September, Reconnaissance Unit 16 had been credited with eliminating more than 400 Japanese soldiers, though the official after-action reports attributed the casualties to conventional combat operations. The unit suffered no losses. In fact, they barely engaged in traditional combat at all. They simply moved through the jungle, and the enemy died or fled or went mad. The pattern repeated itself across the Pacific Theater. In October, another unit was deployed to New Georgia. In November, a third team went to Bougainville. By early 1944, there were 11 active Apache reconnaissance units operating in the region, and the psychological impact on Japanese forces was becoming measurable. Surrender rates increased, desertion rates spiked, and the reports of unexplained phenomena kept coming. But the phenomenon wasn't limited to the enemy. American troops stationed near the Apache units began experiencing similar symptoms: sleep disturbances, vivid nightmares, a pervasive sense of being watched. In December of 1943, a Marine corporal named Thomas Bradford shot himself in his tent on Tarawa. His suicide note mentioned the watchers in the trees and the voices that speak in the old language. Command ordered a psychological evaluation of all personnel who had been in contact with the Apache scouts. The results were classified, and the evaluating psychiatrist, a Captain Eleanor Voss, was transferred to a psychiatric facility in Maryland 3 weeks later. She never practiced medicine again. The documents recovered from Fort Huachuca include several letters from Voss to her colleague, Dr. Nathan Friedman, written between January and April of 1944. The letters were never sent. They were found among her personal effects after her death in 1987. "I don't know how to explain what I'm seeing," Voss wrote in February. "These men, the scouts, they're not exhibiting symptoms of combat stress or drug-induced psychosis. They're exhibiting symptoms of something I can't name. It's as if they've accessed a state of consciousness that shouldn't be possible. They speak about their missions in present tense, even when describing events from weeks ago. They don't sleep. When I asked one of them how he stays alert without rest, he said, 'We don't need to sleep when the ancestors are awake.'" I don't think he was speaking metaphorically. By spring of 1944, Operation Whisper Protocol had expanded beyond the Pacific. Units were deployed to North Africa and Italy. The results were similar. Enemy forces encountered by the Apache scouts reported paranormal experiences, psychological breakdowns, and mass hysteria. But the scouts themselves were changing. They were becoming something other than soldiers. Lieutenant James Yazzie was one of the original recruits from the Datil facility. Before the war, he'd been a schoolteacher on the San Carlos Reservation. He spoke 3 languages and had been considering law school. By July of 1944, when he was interviewed by an Army psychologist in Brisbane, he was barely recognizable as the man who'd enlisted 2 years earlier. "I don't remember what it was like before," Yazzie told the psychologist. "Before we went into the mountains, before the training, I have memories of teaching children, of reading books, of wanting a different life. But those memories feel like they belong to someone else. What I remember now is older. It's the memory of my grandfather's grandfather. It's the memory of every warrior who fought and died to protect our people. And they're not just memories. They're here. They're with us. They guide our hands. They whisper our enemies' names. We're not fighting alone." The interviewer noted that Yazzy's pupils were dilated throughout the conversation, despite the bright afternoon light. His heart rate was abnormally slow, 61 beats per minute, and he never blinked. Not once during the entire 40-minute session. The program should have ended there. By mid-1944, it was clear that Operation Whisper Protocol had succeeded beyond its intended scope, but at a cost that no one had anticipated. The scouts were effective, devastatingly so, but they were no longer functioning as soldiers. They were operating according to rules that predated modern military doctrine by centuries, and they were spreading. Other units, regular infantry and artillery and tank crews, began adopting Apache techniques. Not the tactical ones, but the psychological ones. The meditation, the isolation, the connection to something older than war itself. In August of 1944, Colonel Harwick disappeared. His last known location was the original training facility in New Mexico. A search team found his uniform folded neatly in his quarters, his service weapon disassembled and laid out on his desk, and a handwritten note that read simply, "I understand now. They were never working for us." The facility was shut down in September. The Apache units were officially disbanded, and their members reassigned to conventional infantry divisions. But the reassignments were fiction. Military records show that 43 of the original 47 scouts were listed as killed in action between October 1944 and March 1945. None of their bodies were ever recovered. The remaining 4 scouts simply vanished from all official documentation. No discharge papers, no death certificates, no pension records. It was as if they had never existed. The war ended. The files were sealed. And for 63 years, Operation Whisper Protocol remained buried in the basement of Fort Huachuca. Just another classified program in a century full of them. But the story didn't end in 1945. In 2003, a journalist named Michael Reeves was researching a book about Native American veterans when he encountered something strange. Multiple veterans from different units and different theaters of operation mentioned encounters with Apache soldiers who didn't fight like other men. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. The scouts moved without sound. They appeared and disappeared without explanation. And they knew things they shouldn't have been able to know. Reeves tracked down 3 of the men who had served alongside the Apache units. All 3 refused to be interviewed on the record. One of them, a former sergeant named William Kowalski, agreed to speak anonymously. "I was on Peleliu in September of '44, Kowalski said. "We were pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire, trapped in a coral ridge with no way out. We were ready to die there. And then one of the Apache guys showed up. I don't know where he came from. One second the ridge was empty, and the next second he was standing there, calm as anything, like we were on a Sunday walk instead of in the middle of a firefight. He didn't say a word. He just looked at us, and then he looked toward the Japanese position. And I swear to God, I heard him speaking, but his mouth wasn't moving. The voice was inside my head. It said, 'Follow me when the drums stop.' I asked him what drums. He didn't answer. He just walked toward the enemy position, right out in the open, and they didn't shoot him. They didn't even seem to see him. And then I heard it. Drums. Coming from everywhere and nowhere. Deep, slow drums, like a heartbeat. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, and then it stopped. And when it stopped, the Apache guy turned and gestured for us to follow. We did. We walked right past the Japanese position. They were all dead. Just dead. No wounds. No blood. They were sitting at their guns, and they were dead." Kowalski finished his story and asked Reeves to leave. He died of a heart attack 6 weeks later. He was 59 years old. Reeves continued his research, but he never published his book. In 2007, he sent all his notes and recordings to a colleague at the University of Arizona with instructions not to open them until after his death. Reeves died in 2019. The colleague opened the package and immediately contacted the Department of Defense, requesting clarification on Operation Whisper Protocol. The request was denied. The colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, sister of the archivist who had originally discovered the files, pressed further. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests. She contacted congressional oversight committees. She reached out to Native American tribal councils. And then, in May of 2020, she received a visit from two men who identified themselves as representatives of the Defense Intelligence Agency. They spent 4 hours in her office. They took all her files. They made her sign a non-disclosure agreement. And they told her something that she would later describe as the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. Dr. Chen violated her non-disclosure agreement in 2023, shortly before she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She wrote a statement, had it notarized, and deposited it with her attorney with instructions to release it after her death. She died in January of 2024. The statement was made public in March. They told me that Operation Whisper Protocol never ended, Chen wrote. The scouts didn't die. They didn't disappear. They transcended. That was the word the DIA men used, transcended. They said that the program had achieved its objective, which wasn't to win the war, but to create a new kind of warrior. A warrior that exists outside normal military command structure, outside normal reality. They said that the scouts are still out there, still operating, still fighting wars that the rest of us can't see. And they're recruiting. Every generation, they find new soldiers, new people with the right ancestry and the right psychology. People who can walk between worlds. The DIA men said this like it was a good thing, like it was a program success. But they also said that the military lost control of the scouts in 1944. They said that whatever the scouts are fighting now, whatever war they're waging, it's not America's war. It's older, and it never ends. The evidence of Operation Whisper Protocol's continuation exists in fragments, scattered across decades and buried under layers of bureaucratic obscurity. But for those willing to look, the pattern is undeniable. In 1968, during the height of the Vietnam War, American troops operating in the Central Highlands reported encounters with indigenous fighters who employed tactics that seemed impossible. Not Viet Cong, not North Vietnamese regulars, something else. A Marine named Daniel Ortega, himself of Apache descent, wrote home to his mother in Arizona, describing what he'd witnessed. I saw them last week, Ortega wrote in July of 1968. We were on patrol near Dak To, and we found a Viet Cong camp, or what was left of it. 23 bodies, all dead, all arranged in a circle around a fire pit. They had been dead for maybe 2 days, but there were no signs of combat. No bullet wounds, no trauma. They just looked like they'd sat down and stopped living. And in the center of the circle there was a piece of cloth. It was old, faded, but I recognized the pattern. It was Chiricahua Apache. My grandmother had a blanket with the same design. What the hell was it doing in the middle of the Vietnamese jungle? And who killed those men? Ortega survived Vietnam, but never spoke about his experience again. He returned to Arizona, worked as a mechanic, raised 2 children, and died in 2001. Among his personal effects, his family found a journal he'd kept during the war. Most of the entries were mundane, descriptions of daily life, complaints about the heat and the food and the endless waiting. But the final entry, dated November 3, 1968, was different. I know who they are now. I've seen them. They're not Vietnamese. They're not even alive. Not in the way we think about being alive. They're the ones from the stories. The warriors who never came home from the old wars. The ones who kept fighting even after everyone else surrendered. They found a way to keep going. And now, they're everywhere. I can feel them watching me. I can hear them in my dreams, speaking the old language, telling me that the war never ends, that it can't end, that we're all soldiers in a conflict that started before history and will continue after history forgets us. I'm scared, not of dying. I'm scared of what comes after. I'm scared that when I die, I'll become one of them. The pattern appeared again in Grenada in 1983, in Panama in 1989, in Somalia in 1993. Each time, there were reports of unexplained casualties, enemy combatants found dead without wounds, and American soldiers who claimed to have seen figures that moved through the battlefield like smoke. Each time, the reports were dismissed as stress reactions, the hallucinations of exhausted men in extreme conditions. But the reports were too consistent, too detailed, to be simple fabrications. A Navy SEAL named Robert Chen, no relation to the archivist or the researcher, served in Somalia during Operation Gothic Serpent. On October 4, 1993, during the battle that would later be known as Black Hawk Down, Chen and his team were pinned down in a building surrounded by Somali militia. They had been fighting for 6 hours. They were low on ammunition. They were preparing to make a final stand. And then the drums started. It was the same sound I'd heard my grandfather describe. Chen said in an interview conducted in 2016, 3 years before his death. Deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat, but coming from everywhere at once. The Somalis heard it too. You could see them looking around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. And then they started screaming. Not battle cries, screaming, terror. They dropped their weapons and ran. Just ran. We didn't know what was happening. We thought maybe it was some kind of psychological warfare tactic, some sound weapon we didn't know about. But then I saw them. 3 figures standing on the roof across the street. They were wearing what looked like military gear, but old, from a different era. And they weren't moving. They were just standing there, watching. I looked away for a second, and when I looked back, they were gone. But I could still feel them watching. Chen's team survived. They attributed their survival to luck, to the Somali militia's disorganization, to any explanation that made sense within the normal rules of combat. But Chen never believed it. He spent the rest of his life researching Operation Whisper Protocol, following the same trails that Michael Reeves and Sarah Chen had followed. He accumulated thousands of pages of documents, photographs, witness testimonies, all pointing to the same conclusion. The scouts were real. They were still active, and they were operating under no one's command but their own. Chen's research included a series of interviews he conducted with surviving members of Apache communities in Arizona and New Mexico. Most refused to speak on the record. Those who did speak chose their words carefully, acknowledging the existence of the scouts without providing details. There are warriors among our people who walk a different path. An elder named Thomas Nietzsche told Chen in 2014, "They serve the people, but not in ways that the white man understands. They fight battles that have no beginning and no end. They move between this world and the world of our ancestors. We don't speak their names. We don't call them back. Because if we did, we would have to acknowledge what they've become. And that acknowledgement would change us. It would make us like them. And we're not ready for that. Maybe we never will be." Nietzsche died 6 months after giving that interview. His death was attributed to pneumonia, but his family reported strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to his passing. Drums heard at night, voices speaking in Apache dialects that hadn't been used in generations, and figures seen at the edge of the reservation, standing motionless in the desert, watching. The connection between Operation Whisper Protocol and modern military operations became impossible to ignore after September 11, 2001. The global war on terror created new battlefields, new enemies, and new opportunities for unconventional warfare. And the Scouts, if they truly existed, would have found fertile ground. In 2005, a private military contractor named James Morrison was working in Iraq, providing security for convoys traveling between Baghdad and Fallujah. Morrison was former Army Special Forces, 38 years old, experienced and professional. On November 14, 2005, his convoy was ambushed outside of Ramadi. 3 vehicles were destroyed. 11 people were killed. Morrison survived, but what he saw during the ambush defied explanation. "We were taking fire from all sides," Morrison testified during a Department of Defense inquiry in 2006. "RPGs, small arms, everything. We were done. I'd accepted that I was going to die. And then the fire just stopped. Not gradually. It stopped all at once. I looked out from behind cover, and the insurgents were retreating. No, not retreating. Running. Like they'd seen something that terrified them more than we did. And then I saw him. Just one guy, standing in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards away. He was wearing military gear, but nothing I recognized. And he was just standing there, not moving, not taking cover, like the bullets couldn't touch him. I called out to him, asked who he was, what unit he was with. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, and I felt it. This overwhelming sense that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Something that had been a man once, but wasn't anymore. He turned and walked away, and as he did, I saw something on his shoulder. A patch. It was old and faded, but I could make out the design. It was Apache. Chiricahua Apache. Morrison's testimony was buried in classified files. The official after-action report attributed the ambush's failure to insurgent coordination problems. Morrison left Iraq 2 months later and never worked in private security again. He moved to Montana, bought a small ranch, and avoided all contact with anyone from his past life. In 2019, he agreed to one final interview, conducted by an independent researcher named Elizabeth Takoda, herself a member of the Mescalero Apache tribe. "You want to know what I think?" Morrison told Takoda. "I think we created something during World War II that we couldn't control. We thought we were making better soldiers. We thought we were giving ourselves an advantage. But what we actually did was open a door to something old, something that existed before nations and flags and all the things we fight for. And we let warriors through that door. Warriors who don't fight for America or democracy or oil. They fight because fighting is what they are. It's their nature. And they can't stop. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't stop. Because they're not really alive anymore. There's something between life and death. Between this world and whatever comes after. And they recruit. Every generation, they find new soldiers. People with the right blood. The right connection to the old ways. And those people disappear into the same place the original scouts disappeared. They become part of the war that never ends. The most disturbing piece of evidence came to light in 2018, when a hacker group calling itself Ghost Protocol leaked a series of internal Department of Defense communications. The communications were quickly removed from the internet, and the hackers were arrested within 48 hours. But not before the documents had been downloaded and archived by researchers around the world. The communications detailed something called the Heritage Warrior Program, a classified initiative that had been running continuously since 1946. The program's stated objective was to maintain relationships with indigenous military consultants for purposes of cultural intelligence and unconventional warfare tactics. But the internal memos told a different story. A memo dated March 4, 2012, from a Colonel Richard Hawkins to an unnamed superior, discussed the program's expansion. Request approval for increased recruitment targets, Hawkins wrote. Current active Heritage Warriors number 47, unchanged since 1998. Recent operational demands in Afghanistan and Yemen require expanded capacity. Recommend authorization for 20 additional recruitments from Apache, Navajo, and Lakota communities. Standard psychological screening protocols will be followed. Compound 17 remains effective for initial transformation phase. Training facility in New Mexico remains operational and secure. 47. The same number of original scouts from Operation Whisper Protocol. Compound 17. The same drug cocktail used in 1943. The Heritage Warrior Program wasn't a new initiative. It was a continuation, a refinement. The military had never stopped creating scouts. They had simply become better at hiding them. The leaked documents included a series of incident reports from 2015 describing Heritage Warrior deployments in Syria. The reports were heavily redacted, but the details that remained were chilling. Heritage Warrior Unit 7 deployed to Raqqa Province November 2nd. One report stated, Objective: disruption of ISIS command structure. Results: 137 enemy combatants neutralized over 6-day period. No friendly casualties. No ammunition expended. Local civilians report paranormal activity, including unexplained sounds, visual apparitions, and mass psychological effects among ISIS fighters. Recommend continued deployment. Recommend expansion of authorization for unrestricted operations. No ammunition expended. 137 enemy combatants dead. The scouts were still doing what they had done in Guadalcanal, in Vietnam, in Somalia. They were still fighting a war that existed outside the normal rules of combat. But the most disturbing document in the leak was a psychological evaluation conducted on a Heritage Warrior recruit in 2017. The recruit's name was redacted, but his background was described. 24 years old. Chiricahua Apache descent. Raised on the Fort Apache Reservation. Former Marine Corps infantry. Volunteered for the Heritage Warrior Program after serving 2 tours in Afghanistan. The evaluation was conducted by a military psychiatrist identified only as Dr. M. The psychiatrist noted that the recruit exhibited unusual psychological characteristics, even before beginning the transformation protocol. Subject reports recurring dreams of ancestors, the evaluation stated. Dreams began in childhood and have intensified over time. Subject describes dreams as more vivid than waking life. Subject claims to receive instruction from ancestral figures during dreams, including tactical knowledge and historical information that subject has no normal means of knowing. Subject has developed ability to enter trance states at will. During trance states, subject demonstrates elevated pain tolerance, decreased heart rate, and altered perception of time. Subject expresses strong desire to complete the work that was left unfinished. When asked to clarify, subject states, "The war that started 500 years ago. The war that my ancestors fought. The war that never ended. I want to fight it. I want to finish it." GD. Subject is psychologically suitable for Heritage Warrior Program. Recommend immediate enrollment in Transformation Protocol. The Transformation Protocol, the same process that had been used on the original Scouts: sensory deprivation, meditation, chemical enhancement, and the connection to something older than modern warfare, something that existed in the space between life and death, between the present and the past. The evaluation included a follow-up note dated 6 months later. Subject has completed Transformation Protocol, the note read. Subject no longer responds to birth name. Subject refers to self as one of the walkers. Subject demonstrates full heritage warrior capabilities, including enhanced sensory perception, resistance to physical and psychological trauma, and ability to induce psychological effects in enemy combatants. Subject has been deployed to Yemen. Subject expresses no desire to return to normal life. When asked about family and friends, Subject states, "They are part of a world I left behind. I serve a higher purpose now. I serve the war that never ends." The leaked documents sparked brief outrage in online communities dedicated to government conspiracy theories and military accountability, but the outrage faded quickly. The mainstream media ignored the story. The Department of Defense issued a blanket denial, claiming the documents were fabricated. And within weeks, the Internet had moved on to new scandals, new controversies, new distractions. But for those who had been following the story of Operation Whisper Protocol, the leaked documents confirmed what they had suspected all along. The Scouts were real. The program had never ended. And somewhere, in the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Yemen, the jungles of South America, and perhaps even in the streets of American cities, the heritage warriors were still fighting, still serving a purpose that existed beyond nations and ideologies, still waging a war that had no end. In 2023, a retired Marine colonel named Patricia de Leon published a memoir about her 30-year career in military intelligence. The memoir was mostly unremarkable, standard stories about bureaucracy and politics, and the challenges of military life. But buried in Chapter 17, in a section about unconventional warfare programs, de Leon included a single paragraph that drew little attention at the time, but has since become the subject of intense scrutiny. During my time at the Pentagon, de Leon wrote, I encountered references to programs that existed outside normal command structures, programs that had been initiated during World War II and had evolved over the decades into something that no longer resembled traditional military operations. I was told, on more than one occasion, that there were warriors operating in conflict zones around the world who answered to no general, no president, no chain of command. These warriors fought for reasons that transcended national interest. They fought because they were part of something older and more fundamental than any modern nation-state. I was told that these warriors could not be controlled, only directed. And that direction came not from military leadership, but from something else, something that existed in the collective memory of their people. I was told never to mention these programs in official reports. I was told to forget I had ever heard about them, but I never forgot. And I wonder, sometimes, if forgetting is even possible. Because once you know they exist, once you know that there are soldiers fighting wars we can't see, you start to notice things, patterns, coincidences, events that seem impossible but happen anyway. And you realize that the world is stranger and darker than any of us want to believe. De Leon died in 2024, 3 months after her memoir was published. The official cause of death was a stroke, but her husband reported that in the weeks before her death, she had become increasingly paranoid, claiming she was being watched, that she had made a mistake by writing about the heritage warriors, that she had violated an agreement she should never have broken. The night before she died, de Leon called her daughter and told her something that the daughter would later repeat to investigators. "Your mother said that she'd seen them," the daughter testified. "She said they had come to her house, 3 men. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. They were just there, standing in her living room when she came downstairs in the middle of the night. She said they didn't speak, but she understood what they wanted. They wanted her to know that she'd crossed a line, that some secrets aren't meant to be shared, and that there are consequences for breaking silence. She said they left without touching her, without threatening her. But she knew. She knew that she was going to die. And she knew that her death would look natural, that no one would suspect anything, that the truth would be buried, along with her body. Today, in 2025, 83 years after Operation Whisper Protocol began, the program continues, under different names, with different protocols. But the core objective remains the same: create warriors who exist outside the normal boundaries of life and death. Warriors who serve a purpose that transcends nation and flag. Warriors who fight a war that has no beginning and no end. The recruits still come from Apache communities, from Navajo lands, from Lakota territories. They still undergo transformation protocols that combine indigenous knowledge with modern psychological and chemical manipulation. And they still disappear into a shadow world where the normal rules don't apply, where the line between past and present blurs, where the dead speak to the living, and the living becomes something more and less than human. There are currently 47 active heritage warriors, according to the most recent estimates, the same number that began the program in 1943. Some researchers believe this number is maintained deliberately, that it has significance in Apache tradition, that it represents a balance that must be preserved. Others believe it's simply an administrative decision, a limitation based on resource allocation and security considerations. But those who have studied the program most closely, who have followed the trail of evidence from Guadalcanal to Fallujah to Raqqa, believe something different. They believe that the number 47 isn't a limitation or a tradition. It's a warning. Because in Apache cosmology, there are stories about warriors who walk between worlds, who serve as bridges between the living and the dead. And those stories always mention a specific number, 47. The number of warriors who will fight in the final battle. The battle that ends all battles. The war that consumes the world. Are we approaching that final battle? Are the heritage warriors preparing for something that we can't see? Something that exists beyond our understanding of conflict and violence? Or are they simply doing what they've always done? Fighting enemies in the shadows, protecting a nation that doesn't even know they exist? The answer, like so much about Operation Whisper Protocol and its modern continuation, remains hidden. Hidden in classified files and redacted documents and stories that are told in whispers on reservations across the American Southwest. Hidden in the nightmares of soldiers who have seen things they can't explain. Hidden in the silence of veterans who know the truth, but are too afraid to speak it. But the evidence exists. It has always existed. And for those willing to look, for those willing to see past the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about war and honor and sacrifice, the truth is undeniable. There are warriors among us who have transcended the boundaries that separate life from death, past from present, the natural from the supernatural. They fight wars we don't understand. They serve purposes we can't comprehend. And they will continue fighting long after all of us are gone, long after our nations have crumbled and our civilizations have fallen, because they are part of something eternal. The war never ends. It changes. It evolves. It moves from battlefield to battlefield, from generation to generation. But it never ends, and neither do the warriors who fight it. In the face of such darkness, in the shadow of such enduring conflict, where can we turn? The answer has always been the same, though we often forget it in our fascination with power and violence and the terrible things humans can become. We turn to God. We turn to Jesus Christ. We turn to the light that exists beyond all shadows, the truth that transcends all lies, the love that conquers even death itself. Because if there are warriors who walk between worlds, if there are forces at work in our reality that we cannot fully understand, then we need something greater than human wisdom to guide us. We need faith. We need grace. We need the assurance that no matter how dark the world becomes, no matter what horrors lurk in the shadows, there is a light that darkness cannot overcome. Follow God. Follow Jesus Christ. Because in the end, when all the wars are finished and all the warriors have returned to dust, only love remains. Only truth endures. Only faith can carry us through the darkness into the light that awaits on the other side.